Anxiety, in the world's vernacular, has become as common as the traffic jam or a sleepless night, an inevitable condition of modernity, a companion to ambition, and an emblem of contemporary suffering. But is anxiety truly a product of the 21st century's information storms, or does its architecture run far deeper? What if almost everything popularly broadcast about anxiety, its symptoms, its shallow remedies, its supposed technological cause, misses the heart of the matter entirely? Before Freud, anxiety was merely unease or hysteria. Today, it is an industry, a culture, a label, a clinical diagnosis, and sometimes, it is the only truth a person feels. Unpacking this complexity demands we travel not just through the shifting landscape of psychiatry, but into the subterranean vaults of the mind's architecture as rendered visible by Freud, the uncompromising archaeologist of the soul. Startling as it may sound, mainstream discourse surrounding anxiety has streamlined its meaning, reducing it to a checklist: racing heart, restlessness, dread, avoidance, inviting the proliferation of quick fixes. Medications, surface-level cognitive techniques, mindfulness apps, all are peddled in the global bazaar as answers to an omnipresent threat. But for Freud, these solutions, though palliative, fail to address anxiety's real origins. Are we, then, merely chasing symptoms, distracted by the visible flickers, while the engine itself hums undisturbed below consciousness? To truly understand, we must unhinge the popular narrative and examine the machinery that lurks behind the curtain. Tracing anxiety's lineage, we quickly realize it is no mere byproduct of modern overstimulation, nor the exclusive disease of overthinkers. Within the folds of ancient texts, sorrow and trepidation are presented as cosmic afflictions, punishments or warnings. However, it was the Enlightenment, which promised the dominance of reason, that unwittingly fertilized anxiety's modern soil. When the expectation that rationality would cure irrational discomfort failed, a crucial question arose: what if reason is not the master of the psyche, but only its surface? Sigmund Freud, emerging amid the intellectual ferment of late 19th century Vienna, proposed a heresy: underneath calm rationality lies a seething underworld of drives, conflicts, and desires. For Freud, anxiety was not a problem to be eradicated by willpower or rationalization. Instead, it was a signal, a message from the unconscious, sent to alert us to the unsolved, the unspoken, the unacceptable. This radical position did not merely shift the conversation, it detonated long-held certainties about the mind's transparency. Freud's view drew heavily on his observations of patients whose anxieties could not be traced to any immediate external stimulus. Why, he wondered, would someone fear everything and nothing, unless something invisible was at play? Diving deeper, Freud complicated anxiety's history by placing it at the crossroads of biology and culture. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he describes anxiety as a product of inner conflict, most notably, between the id, primitive desires, the superego, internalized social norms, and the ego, mediator. Here, anxiety serves as an early warning system, alerting the ego to threats whether real or imagined. If the id's forbidden desires threaten to breach conscious awareness, anxiety emerges to police the boundary, often through symptoms, compulsions, irrational fears, that camouflage the true source of distress. Thus, anxiety, for Freud, is as much about what is hidden as what is felt. Ordinarily, one expects anxiety to be proportionate to danger. Yet, the Freudian view unravels this tidy equation. The anxiety arising in the human soul is, more often than not, displaced, its object masked, its origins veiled. A phobia of open spaces, a fixation on rituals, even the inexplicable feeling of impending doom, these are not quirks or errors, but ingenious ways the psyche defends itself from deeper, more destabilizing knowledge. In everyday life, this means a person may spend years treating stress at work, while the true conflict, an unacknowledged childhood trauma, a repressed guilt, remains undisturbed, unprocessed. Is it not astonishing, then, how society lines up solutions for the symptom, while rarely asking, what is it that the mind is striving so hard to hide? To appreciate the full daring of Freud's claim, one must grasp how societies naturalize anxiety, presenting it as an unavoidable cost of civilization, as if it were the weather. Consider the rise of technology. Many would blame phones, emails, social media as generators of anxiety, but Freud would scoff at this reductionism. Tools may shape the form of anxiety, but its engine is powered by the ancient tangle of desire and prohibition. Even prehistoric men, Freud posited, trembled before their own aggressive and erotic impulses, sensing that civil order depended on repression. Modernity, with its noise, is merely the latest stage in an unbroken drama. We are not more anxious because of the internet, but because the cultural scripts for handling forbidden feelings have grown more complex, and sometimes more contradictory. Between art and society, anxiety lingers as both muse and malady. In the tormented figures of Edvard Munch's The Scream, or the fractured, alienated subjects of contemporary installation art, the visual vocabulary of anxiety is writ large, a constant struggle with an internal void. Art becomes, in this sense, a laboratory for negotiating repressed experiences. What cannot be spoken in polite company finds shape and color on canvas. But while artists may sublimate their anxiety, most people lack such outlets. Instead, repression becomes the rule, and anxiety morphs from a temporary discomfort into a chronic condition. Delving into the sociological dimension, Freud anticipated modern debates about mental health stigma. Why is it that even as diagnoses proliferate, and help is made widely available, so many suffer in silence? The answer lies in how social norms covertly demand emotional conformity. To admit anxiety is to risk exposure as fragile, irrational, or not coping. Thus, anxiety, while seemingly ubiquitous, wears a mask. It adapts, it camouflages, and it leverages the very script society offers: overwork, perfectionism, cynicism, in order to hide its real roots. In this sense, anxiety is both a private experience and a public performance, managed, rebranded, medicalized, but rarely understood. The culture of wellness, with its rituals and jargon, may in fact serve as a new mechanism of repression, promising relief, but subtly imposing new dictates about how one should feel. What, then, maintains anxiety's grip? For Freud, its power is sustained by the uncanny alliance between psychic defenses and social regulation. The unconscious props up its walls with rationalizations, while institutions, education, religion, family, reinforce the taboo against acknowledging what is truly distressing. The more compelling these strategies become, the more likely the original conflict goes underground, persisting, mutating, sometimes erupting as physical symptoms or compulsions. Illustration: the ambitious executive develops a paralytic fear of public speaking, not because of incompetence, but because a deeper, childhood humiliation, never allowed conscious recognition, has been displaced onto the present scenario. The unnatural origin story sold by culture, some people just get anxious on stage, misses the point. The executive's anxiety is not about the audience, but about protecting the ego from a trauma too destabilizing to confront directly. The near invisibility of such processes ensures anxiety's disguise as natural or inevitable. But is it really? Biological models, popularized by neuroscience, treat anxiety as a quasi-mechanical malfunction: too much amygdala activity, not enough serotonin. Pharmaceuticals promise normalization. But Freud's critique pierces this narrative. To reduce anxiety to neural chemistry is to ignore its meaning, its function, and its message. It is a conversation stopper, pathologizing suffering that may be deeply logical given the individual's psychic history. Biology provides the canvas, the psyche paints upon it with the pigments of desire, trauma, memory. At the heart of Freud's paradigm, disturbing as it may be to contemporary sensibilities, is the notion that autonomy is always incomplete. The self, far from being transparent and unified, is crosscut by conflicting forces. Anxiety reveals not only this internal discord, but also the limits of our autonomous agency. Culture teaches us to valorize choice, but rarely reveals that choices are themselves shaped by unconsciously negotiated compromises between the ego and superego. Every declaration of intent, every impulse suppressed, every boundary transgressed is negotiated across this hidden terrain. Anxiety is thus not merely a bug in the system, it is a sign of the system's depth, complexity, and vulnerability to its own inner contradictions. Such realizations raise the stakes for any strategy of emancipation, whether individual or collective. Political theorists have drawn upon Freud to explain mass hysteria, popular delusions, and the irrational turns of history. Totalitarian regimes, for example, have channeled collective anxiety into scapegoating, externalizing inner conflict as social paranoia. Advertisers capitalize on latent anxieties to sell everything from deodorant to insurance. Technologies of surveillance play on the primal fear of being found out. In all cases, the surface is never the story. The psychic stage is crowded with actors no one sees. Nor is this confined to collective life. On the biological level, anxiety is entangled with the habits of the body. The racing heart, the shallow breath, the sweaty palms, these are not accidents, but responses choreographed by millions of years of evolution. And yet, for Freud, these responses are never naked. They are saturated with meaning, shaped by the individual's unique blend of drives and conflicts. The same pang of anxiety, in one person a prompt to action, in another a prescription for paralysis. In animals, flight or fight; in people, sometimes talk therapy, sometimes art, sometimes self-destruction. But is the legacy of Freud unchallenged? Contemporary psychology has staged a rebellion. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, sidesteps repressed trauma in favor of the here and now, changing thoughts, adjusting behaviors. Proponents tout its efficacy, quick, direct, free from the interminable introspection of psychoanalysis. It works, at least for many. But the Freudian rejoinder persists: symptom relief is not the end of the story. The source of the anxiety, the knot of history and desire, is left untouched, likely to return in another guise. Is this efficiency, or is it just repression by another name? Freud's approach, listening without preconception, decoding dreams, exploring slip-ups and jokes, offered a path not of curing anxiety but of understanding its origins and, through understanding, rendering its power negotiable. In this light, anxiety morphs from an alien invasion into a source of self-knowledge. For the analyst, the question is not, how do I rid myself of anxiety, but, what is my anxiety trying to tell me, and what am I refusing to hear? This is not the language of symptom management, but of self-revelation, a stance both treacherous and liberating. Consider, then, a case generic yet resonant. A woman, suffering recurring panic attacks, finds that no amount of meditation or medication frees her from dread. In therapy, fragments of childhood materialize, moments of disappointment, unspoken rivalries, feelings of abandonment. Her anxiety, it emerges, is not about the present but about an unresolved conflict between loyalty to her parents, superego, and her own budding ambitions, id, from years before. Such conflicts, repressed but unforgotten, fuel the panic until finally, through the work of remembering, the energy they sequester is released. It is not the anxiety that is resolved, but the knot of meanings which kept it alive. A closer inspection reveals that anxiety, as viewed from a Freudian lens, is organized along a temporal axis. It does not point simply to the future, as a signal of possible dangers, but to the past, the return of the repressed. Our present suffering draws its power from unfinished psychic business. This mechanism explains the often cited paradox that people experience anxiety in situations that are objectively safe. The threat is not out there, but in here. But if anxiety is the return of the past, how is it to be overcome? Medications can blunt the experience, techniques can distract, but only insight can dissolve the knot. This is the slow, uncertain work Freud called working through, the process by which unconscious patterns are recognized, named, and thereby, slowly, drained of their compulsive force. It is the difference between silencing an alarm and disarming the device altogether. By this measure, true autonomy is recovered only through knowledge not of facts, but of the self's history, its wounds, its wishes. Yet, even as psychoanalysis reveals the hidden structures of suffering, it is not hostile to the tools of modernity. Freud himself was pragmatic. He acknowledged that sometimes, symptom relief is necessary before deep work can begin. In our contemporary world, technology offers novel means to support reflection. Digital diaries, mood trackers, remote therapy, these may create new spaces for the mind's exploration, provided they serve insight, not avoidance. What distinguishes genuine treatment from mere management, in the Freudian diagnosis, is whether one dares to confront the intolerable truth behind the symptom. The intersection of Freud's thinking with modern science is neither oppositional nor seamless. Neuroscience, for instance, has illuminated the plasticity of the brain, confirming that early trauma can remake neural pathways. But no amount of brain anatomy can replace the painstaking hermeneutics of meaning, the symbolic labor of untangling what anxiety means for a particular person. It is at this threshold, between biology and autobiography, chemistry and narrative, that the paradox of anxiety is most acute. Art and literature, too, continue to illuminate anxiety's riddle. In Kafka's stories, the characters are seized by inscrutable fears, punished by invisible authorities, a clear echo of the Freudian account of internalized law. Horror films tap into unconscious anxieties, allowing collective working through of primal fears in symbolic forms. In dance and performance art, the body, so often the instrument of repression, becomes the canvas for reckoning with the hidden and the forbidden. Through these and other media, society creates spaces where anxiety can be seen, if only obliquely, and thereby transformed. One might ask, is it comforting or disturbing to recognize that anxiety is not an alien force, but an integral feature of consciousness, a faithful messenger dispatched by the psyche to warn of conflicts unacknowledged? Does this realization empower or paralyze? What possibilities open when, instead of banishing anxiety, we listen and attempt to understand its language? Herein lies the radical promise, and the ultimate challenge, of Freud's vision. If you are weary of wrestling with anxiety, feeling battered by waves of sensation you cannot explain, perhaps you stand at the edge of your own psychic archaeology. The truth, seldom named in popular discourse, is that anxiety is not your enemy, it is your clue. It is the signpost to what remains unlived, unsaid, unfinished. The question is not how to banish it, but how to use it. Imagine, then, a society that took Freud's challenge seriously. Instead of marshalling choruses of "manage your symptoms," it would ask, what is our collective anxiety a sign of? What conflict or injury have we repressed at a social level, inequality, trauma, injustice? Here, psychoanalysis reveals its political edge. It is not accidental that every age has its anxiety, each with a particular color and shape: the Cold War's paranoia, the millennial existential dread, the climate crisis's background hum. Each is an echo of something denied, something orphaned from discourse, but not from feeling. On the micro level, individuals, once oriented toward insight, develop tools for self-liberation. This is not the power pose or a pep talk, but a diligent, often painful, inquiry. Journaling, analysis, creative expression, each becomes a site for uncovering the story the anxiety is desperate to tell. For some, this means facing the horror of betrayal, failure, loss. For others, it is the challenge of recognizing forbidden wishes, of mourning the lives unlived. The reward for such courage is not happiness in the conventional sense, but the restoration of integrity, the knowledge that every part of the self, even the most painful, has been witnessed. In this sense, strategies for dismantling the effects of anxiety must depart from the transactional. They are not tools, in the productivity sense, but frameworks for living otherwise. They demand a radical honesty, a suspension of pretense, an openness to discomfort. The transformation, when it comes, is subtle. One does not become fearless, but one learns to read the signals. What was once paralyzing becomes informative. Where once the unknown felt overwhelming, now there is curiosity, even awe. This approach generates ripple effects, both internal and external. Autonomy, previously conceived as freedom from anxiety, becomes freedom to encounter it without terror. People cease to fear the dark and instead learn to decipher its signals. At the collective level, new conversations emerge, about trauma, about taboo, about the unrecognized costs of silence. Institutions, too, might adapt, shifting from policing deviation to supporting complexity. Education becomes not only about knowledge but about emotional literacy. The measure of maturity ceases to be tranquility, and becomes the capacity to tolerate, and even benefit from, dissonance. Returning to the beginning, the truth about anxiety, and the reason almost no one speaks it, is that it cannot be separated from the adventure of being fully human. In the libretto of psychoanalysis, every anxiety announces an unfinished task. Freud was clear: those who seek merely not to feel, will remain prisoners of the symptom. But those who dare to listen, who patiently trace the symptom's origins, can at last begin to negotiate with their own complexity. Do you recognize yourself here? Do you tire of half measures and yearn for explanation, not excuses? Freud's invitation awaits: to watch, to listen, to understand, yourself, and perhaps, in time, the world that shaped you. Exchange numbness for insight, trade quick fixes for honest analysis. This, finally, is the truth that few will tell you about anxiety. It is not a curse, but the beginning of a conversation that, if you dare follow it, will reveal both your wound and the means by which you might, someday, heal. If you are ready to end the battle with symptoms alone and seek the wisdom buried in struggle, take the first step, watch, reflect, and share. For in building a culture that listens, not just medicates, we lay the foundation for a future where anxiety no longer enslaves, but enlightens.